I still remember the exact moment it happened. The instant a sentence left my lips before my thoughts had fully formed, like a spark jumping from dry wood before you realize there's fire. I didn't plan to say it. I didn't rehearse it. But somehow, without permission or pause, it slipped through the space between one heartbeat and the next, and by the time it reached the ears it was never meant to wound, it was already too late to call it back. What followed wasn't immediate chaos or confrontation, but something quieter and far more lasting. The unmistakable stillness of a hurt that sinks deeper than neither of you expected. I saw it in their face, not anger, not even confusion, but a kind of silent recoil, like someone stepping back from a sudden cold wind. I don't even remember the conversation that came after. I only remember the weight that settled in my chest as I realized what I had done. Later that night, long after the words were spoken and the room had grown still, I found myself reliving that moment with an almost painful clarity. The scene replayed itself with stubborn consistency, looping over and over with the same question rising to the surface each time like a tide returning to the shore. Why did I say that? I kept waiting for the answer to change, for the regret to soften, but it didn't. It stayed. I've learned that some of the most lasting wounds we inflict are delivered not by action, but by language. Sharp phrases launched in haste, careless remarks offered without thought, truths twisted slightly by emotion, or even truths spoken in the wrong spirit, at the wrong time, with the wrong intent. And what's hardest to accept is this: those moments come from within us, not outside. No one pushed the words into my mouth. They were mine. And they came from somewhere I didn't want to admit existed.
There is a specific kind of sorrow that follows a sentence you wish you could take back. Not because it was wrong in fact, but because it was wrong in heart. It's the sorrow of knowing that you stood at the edge of a choice, and instead of stepping back, you let something dark and unfiltered pass through your voice and land where it could not be unseen, unheard, or unlived. At first, I tried to explain it to myself. I reached for all the justifications that come so quickly when we want to dodge the weight of our own words. I was tired. I was under pressure. I didn't mean it like that. They misunderstood me. And maybe all those things were true, in some sense. But no explanation seemed to change the simple, unshakable fact that I had spoken something that should have remained unsaid. I had crossed a line, not because of volume or language, but because of what had been behind it. It's strange how speech can feel both effortless and irreversible. We use words constantly, as casually as breath, and yet every so often one of them lands in a way we cannot undo, and suddenly we see just how sharp our tongue can be. It's a power we don't think about until it has already caused harm. And by then, all we can do is try to heal what should never have been wounded. I believe there is something sacred about silence. Not the silence that comes from fear or indifference, but the kind that rises from wisdom, the kind that holds back until the moment is right or the heart is clean. That kind of silence is a strength I'm still learning. It's a choice I wish I had made that day. What surprised me most wasn't just how deeply the words hurt the person who heard them, but how deeply they stayed with me. I realized that speech isn't just something we offer others. It's something we leave behind in ourselves, something we have to live with long after the moment has passed. And sometimes the echo of what we say can be louder inside than it ever was out loud.
I don't want to be someone whose speech causes quiet damage. I don't want to wake up with memories of conversations that ended in regret. I want to become someone who listens longer, speaks slower, and treats each word like it matters. Because it does. Every word, every sentence, every breath of speech is a kind of offering, and what we choose to offer shapes more than just the mood in a room. It shapes the person we are becoming. Since that day, I've begun to pray not just for forgiveness, but for refinement. I ask not only to be cleansed of careless words, but to be reshaped into someone whose heart speaks gently, even when frustrated, even when misunderstood, even when hurt. And I know that starts not with my mouth, but with my soul, with what lives in the hidden places where speech begins long before it's spoken. There's something holy about that kind of transformation when the inside is made whole so that the outside can speak peace. It's slow work. It's humbling, but it's worth it. Because I've seen what happens when I don't pause, don't reflect, don't hold back. And I've learned that the cost of those moments is far greater than the silence I failed to choose. That is the moment I regretted it. And that is the reason I am learning a different way to speak.
There is a kind of fire that doesn't burn the skin and doesn't need a match. It doesn't rage in the open or leave behind ashes that anyone can sweep away. This fire lives in a smaller place, a place so familiar we rarely consider the danger it holds. Right behind the teeth, beneath the tongue, curled deep in the warmth of everyday conversation. It is not loud by default, but it is always waiting, and when it ignites, it does not just singe, it scorches what we thought would never be touched. The scriptures speak of it with almost unsettling precision. The tongue, it says, is set on fire by hell itself. And when I first heard that as a child, I thought it was poetic exaggeration, a dramatic way of warning us not to swear, not to lie, not to gossip. But the older I got, and the more I listened to the sound of voices, not only those around me, but my own, I began to understand what those words meant. Because there truly is something terrifying about how easily the tongue can become an instrument of destruction, wrapped in the illusion of harmless sound. It doesn't take shouting. It doesn't take obscenities. All it takes is the wrong sentence at the wrong moment from a heart that's just slightly off-center, a sarcastic reply, a clipped answer, a truth spoken without grace, a joke that lands like a slap instead of a smile. And suddenly something shifts in the room, maybe subtly, maybe so gently it's almost imperceptible. But the damage has already begun, not outside, inside. I used to think that violence required hands, that to hurt someone you had to raise your voice, raise your fist, raise a weapon. But then I watched what happened when someone's confidence was dismantled with a sentence, when a child's spirit was crushed with a single comment, when a friend's trust was pulled apart, not with betrayal, but with repeated dismissiveness that always came dressed as honesty. And I realized we don't need fists to cause wounds. Most of us do our deepest harm with what we say. There is a reason James wrote that if anyone can tame the tongue, they are able to master their whole body. Because the tongue is not just an organ of speech, it is a mirror of the heart's unrest. It does not light fires by accident. The spark always comes from somewhere. Frustration, fear, pride, jealousy, pain. And when the tongue speaks from those places, it does not soothe. It ignites. And what's more terrifying is how quickly it happens. You can be having a normal day, nothing particularly wrong, and suddenly something small presses against an old wound or an unmet expectation, and before you even realize what's rising in your throat, it's already out. A flare shot across a dry field. And later, when the dust settles, when the moment passes, you're left standing in the smoke, wondering how something so small caused so much harm. What gives words this kind of power isn't just their content. It's the soul behind them. You can say something technically accurate and still devastate someone if you say it with contempt. You can speak a truth and still weaponize it. The fire doesn't come from vocabulary. It comes from the heat of the heart. And that's why no amount of linguistic discipline can save us if we don't let the deeper places be changed. I've seen people walk out of rooms they never returned to because of a single conversation. I've seen relationships grow cold over years, not because of one big betrayal, but because of a steady drip of words that slowly drained the trust from the air. I've heard the laughter of someone slowly dim because they started to believe what others had carelessly repeated in their presence, words they didn't even mean, but which still landed like poison. And I've done the same. Not because I wanted to destroy anything, not because I planned to hurt, but because I wasn't watching the fire that lives in my own mouth. I didn't feel the heat gathering when I let my impatience rise. I didn't recognize the match between my teeth. And then I spoke.
That's the danger of it. It doesn't always feel like fire when you're the one holding it. Sometimes it feels like justice, like truth, like the thing that just needs to be said. But even fire that starts as light will consume when it's not contained. Even truth, when delivered without grace, burns more than it heals. So what do we do with this fire? Some will say suppress it, say less, be quiet. And there's wisdom in that, to a degree. But I found that silence alone doesn't heal anything. What changes us is not just taming the tongue, but tending the flame. Learning where the heat begins. Learning how to cool it with mercy. Learning how to pause long enough for the Spirit to speak instead. Because words, like fire, are not evil by nature. Fire warms homes, cooks meals, brings light in the dark. And words, when born in love, do the same. But when either is let loose without care, they devour. And what they take, trust, dignity, peace, often takes far longer to rebuild than it did to destroy. There is a fire that lives in the mouth, and there is a greater fire that lives in the heart of God. Not one that devours, but one that refines, one that cleanses, one that teaches us how to speak with gentleness and strength, with honesty and reverence, with a voice shaped not by our own wounds, but by His love. And I want that fire instead.
There comes a moment in every life, often quietly, without fanfare, when the illusion of moral distance begins to fade, and we suddenly see ourselves not as better than others, not as immune, but simply as human. And it's in that moment, maybe more than any other, that humility begins its slow and sacred work. I had one of those moments, not in a church, not during a sermon, but alone, after a conversation I'd rather forget. And the realization came with a weight I wasn't ready for. I am no different. It sounds simple, even obvious. Of course we all fail. Of course we all stumble. But there's a subtle and dangerous way we distance ourselves from that truth, by measuring our mistakes against someone else's more visible ones, by imagining that because our words weren't shouted or profane or cruel, they were somehow clean. And yet,
when I was honest with myself, painfully honest, I could see the trail of moments behind me. Sentences spoken in irritation, dismissiveness, sarcasm, defensiveness, pride. Not explosive, not scandalous, but still sharp enough to cut. The truth is, we all sin with our words, every one of us. There's not a single person who has walked through this life without wounding someone with something they said or didn't say. Some of us do it in anger, some in fear, some in ignorance, and some without even realizing the damage has been done. But if we were to trace the echoes of our own voices, back through the years, back through the rooms and relationships we've moved through, I think we'd all find moments we wish we could erase. I've sat with people who carry the weight of a sentence they spoke decades ago. I've listened to mothers who regret the tone they used when their child needed tenderness. I've heard from husbands and wives who, in one unguarded moment, let bitterness take shape in language and have been trying ever since to rebuild the trust that moment tore down. And in every story, no matter the context or the age, there's the same quiet confession at the center. I didn't mean to hurt him, but I did.
There's something deeply human about that admission. Not just the guilt of the act, but the grief of seeing ourselves as we are. We want to be people whose words bring life, whose speech blesses, whose mouths reflect the love we claim to carry. And yet, again and again, we find ourselves slipping. Sometimes without warning, sometimes despite our best intentions. It's humbling. And if we let it be, it can also be healing. Because when we admit our shared weakness, when we stop pretending that our words are always measured, always righteous, always pure, we make space for grace. For others, yes, but also for ourselves. And grace, I've learned, doesn't come to those who perform perfection. It comes to those who confess reality, who open their hands and say, I too have spoken things I cannot unsay. I remember a conversation with a friend, someone who had just come through a painful conflict with someone they loved. They were telling me how it all unraveled, and what stayed with me wasn't the details, but the ache in their voice when they said, I just didn't think my words would land that hard. That sentence rang in my head for days, because isn't that so often the case? We speak, and we assume the other person will understand, will forgive, will forget. And then we're stunned when the fracture lingers. But perhaps the greatest wound our words cause is not in others, but in what they reveal about us. That under the calm exterior, there are still shadows we haven't fully faced. That under the theology and conviction and spiritual discipline, there are still places in our hearts where ego, fear, and frustration speak louder than faith. And it is only when those places come to light that healing can begin.
I used to think that confession was weakness, that admitting fault made you small, but I've come to believe the opposite. It is in the act of saying, me too, of lowering the shield and telling the truth that we become truly strong. Because in that moment, we are no longer hiding. We are no longer performing. We are finally standing in the light, where healing is possible. And so I say it now, with no defense, no excuse, no attempt to soften the impact. I have sinned with my words. I have spoken in pride. I have withheld kindness. I have used my voice to protect myself instead of protect others. I have said things I knew would sting. I have dressed my judgments in humor. I have let silence speak when compassion was required. And I truly know, I am not alone. We all do it, all of us. The same mouth that sings, that prays, that encourages, also complains, condemns, dismisses, exaggerates. This is the paradox of being human, but it is not the end of the story. Because confession is not just a mirror, it is also a door, a way forward, a beginning.
And if we are willing to enter that space with humility, with honesty, with trembling courage, we might just find that the same mouth which once wounded can be taught to heal.
There's a quiet truth we rarely pause to consider. A truth so simple it often goes unnoticed, and yet so foundational it shapes the very way we live. The mouth does not act alone. Every word we speak, whether born in love or in bitterness, is not just a product of impulse or habit or upbringing. It is a reflection, a revealing, an outflow from something deeper. The mouth, in all its complexity, is merely an echo chamber of the heart. I used to think my speech existed in a separate category, something I could manage with effort, with restraint, with a little more discipline. I believed that if I simply trained myself to pause longer before responding, to weigh my tone, to rehearse kindness, I could eventually overcome the moments of failure. And though all of that holds value, none of it reaches the source. Because language at its root is never random. It begins in the places no one sees. When Jesus said that out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaks, he wasn't offering a metaphor. He was describing a mechanism, a law of the soul, that what is stored in the depths of our inner world will inevitably make its way out through our voices. Not always immediately, not always obviously, but eventually the heart speaks, and when it does, it uses the tongue as its instrument. I remember a moment, quiet, seemingly insignificant, when someone asked me how I was, and I replied with words that were far sharper than the question required. I heard myself as if from a distance, and I felt confused by the tone I had taken. But later, alone, I realized it had nothing to do with them. My response had been rehearsed not in my mouth, but in my heart, where frustration, unspoken grief, and weariness had been accumulating without acknowledgement. That answer wasn't a slip. It was a symptom.
It is humbling to accept that no matter how careful we are, we cannot speak consistently with kindness if our hearts remain unhealed. We may manage for a while. We may sound gracious in public, but when we are tired or caught off guard or pressed by life, what is hidden will surface. The mouth will not lie for the soul forever. It will, in time, reveal us. And this, perhaps more than anything, has changed the way I pray. I no longer ask simply for better words. I ask for a better well. I no longer plead only for restraint in speech. I plead for transformation in spirit. Because I have come to believe that the tongue does not need a tighter leash. It needs a new master. One not driven by ego or fear or the pressure to be right, but one who sees what lies beneath and offers the kind of healing that discipline alone cannot bring. We often focus on external speech because it is what others hear. It is what they remember. It is what wounds or restores. But God listens deeper. He hears the words before they form. He listens to the sentences buried in silence. And he responds not to the polish of our language, but to the truth within us. And if we let him, he begins his work not at the lips, but at the root, shaping not only what we say, but what we long for, what we fear, what we carry, without words. I've come to see my moments of verbal failure not as shameful interruptions, but as invitations, little alarms that something deeper needs attention. A bitter phrase is often a symptom of an unattended wound.
A sarcastic remark might mask a deep insecurity. A defensive response may signal a heart that has not yet learned the safety of grace. And so instead of simply correcting the behavior, I now ask a different question. What part of my heart said that? Because once we see speech as a window, not a wall, we begin to understand that words are not obstacles to holiness. They are signposts. They tell the truth about what still needs mercy. They reveal where love has not yet taken root, and they give us a chance, if we're willing to listen, to turn toward healing instead of hiding. I used to think God wanted me to control my tongue. Now I believe He wants to free it, not by force, but by filling the heart it speaks from with His gentleness, His patience, His truth. Because when the heart is changed, the mouth no longer needs managing. It becomes a vessel. And in time, the voice that once carried heat and haste, the voice that once wounded and worried, begins to carry peace instead. Not because it has been trained, but because it has been transformed. That is the mystery of grace. It does not simply tell us what not to say. It gives us something better to speak from, something clean, something whole, something holy. And I am still learning what it means to live from that place.
There is a kind of wisdom that does not announce itself. It does not rush to speak, nor does it clamor for attention in the noise of the room. It sits quietly at the edge of conflict, observing without the need to interrupt. It waits. It listens. And when it does choose to speak, it does so with a weight that silence has already prepared. I have always admired that kind of presence, the ability to remain still when provoked, to remain soft when pressed, to hold a response not out of fear or pride, but from the quiet knowledge that not everything must be said, and not every moment is asking for a voice. There is a verse in Proverbs attributed to Solomon that echoes with that kind of strength. He who restrains his lips is wise. And the more I walk through life, the more I understand how difficult and how powerful that restraint truly is. Because silence, when rooted in wisdom, is never empty. It is full of discernment. It carries the weight of understanding that words have direction, and once released, they do not float, they fly. They do not dissolve, they land. And depending on the condition of the heart from which they came, they will either plant peace or scatter harm. I've known moments when I wanted desperately to speak, to defend myself, to correct, to clarify, to make sure my truth was heard, and yet something in my spirit held me back. And afterward, as the tension dissolved and time revealed what words could not have improved, I felt the grace of that silence settle around me like a shelter. I did not lose anything by waiting. I did not miss an opportunity by withholding. I had, for once, chosen the better part.
But it is not always easy. We live in a world that rewards quick speech, that celebrates sharp replies, that confuses volume with confidence and speed with intelligence. And in such a world, pausing before we speak can feel like weakness, or uncertainty, or even fear. Yet what I've learned, often through failure, is that the truest strength is not found in the sharpness of our words, but in the clarity of our spirit before we speak them. Wisdom does not forbid speech. It shapes it. It teaches us to weigh our motives before we open our mouths. It teaches us that just because something is true does not mean it is timely. That just because we are ready to speak does not mean the other is ready to hear. And that sometimes the most loving thing we can offer is not our opinion, but our silence. A silence that honors the complexity of the moment, that makes room for grace to do its work. There is a sacredness in those pauses, in those deep breaths taken just before we respond, and those silent prayers that whisper, "God, help me say only what carries your peace." I've begun to build small spaces into my days for that kind of stillness, not just in conversations, but in the spaces between them. And slowly, I've seen how those spaces change things. I no longer feel the urgency to fill every silence. I no longer fear being misunderstood if I don't explain everything. I am beginning to trust that God is not only in the speech, but in the stillness that surrounds it. That sometimes the holiest thing I can do in a conversation is to let it breathe, to listen without composing a response, to absorb without defending, to care more about the person than about being right.
And this, I believe, is the heart of wisdom. It is not found in perfect answers or clever phrasing or having something to say in every moment. It is found in the soul that has learned to slow down, to discern, to ask not, "What should I say?" but "What is needed here, if anything?" Sometimes the answer is silence. Sometimes it is softness. Sometimes it is truth spoken with trembling hands. But always, always, it begins with listening. There is a passage that says, "A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in settings of silver." And I have come to believe that such words are not found quickly. They are found in stillness, formed slowly in the presence of God, spoken not from impulse, but from reverence. We do not always need to speak first. We do not always need to speak at all. But when we do, may our words be shaped by wisdom, not the wisdom of the world, which exalts the loud and the proud, but the wisdom from above, which is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruit. That is the voice I want to carry, and that is the silence I want to protect.
There is a kind of fear that does not paralyze. It does not crush the soul or tighten the chest or leave us trembling in the dark. It does not shame us into silence or push us to perform for acceptance. This fear, the fear that saves, is different in nature, different in texture, different in the way it touches the human heart. It is not the fear of punishment, nor the dread of rejection, but a sacred trembling that rises when the soul becomes aware of something greater than itself, holy, infinite, near. The Scriptures call it the fear of the Lord, and far from being a relic of old religion or an outdated term for reverence, it is something living, something powerful, something that still speaks into our most modern moments with ancient wisdom. And if we let it, it becomes not a burden, but a compass, not a reason to hide, but a reason to kneel. I remember a time when I spoke too quickly, when my words, though technically correct, were soaked in pride. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't use coarse language, but I knew, even as I was speaking, that I was no longer listening for the voice of God. I was performing for my own approval. I was more concerned with being right than with being righteous. And when the moment passed, and I stood alone with the echo of my speech, I felt it, that still, quiet grief that comes when the Spirit withdraws just enough to let you hear the hollowness of your own voice. That grief, I believe, is a gift. It is not condemnation. It is the gentle whisper of a holy presence reminding us that our words are never spoken in isolation. Every sentence is spoken before the face of God. Every phrase carries not only weight in this world, but reflection of the world to come. And when we live without that awareness, we drift, slowly, subtly, into a way of speaking that serves ourselves, not the one who gave us speech in the first place.
The fear of the Lord is not about walking on eggshells. It is about walking in the light. It is about remembering, not with panic, but with reverence, that the God who listens to our prayers also listens to our casual remarks, our hallway conversations, our digital exchanges, our whispered critiques. He is not distant, he is not disengaged, he is near, intimately, relentlessly near. And that nearness, if we allow ourselves to feel it, should change us. It should slow us down. It should soften our tone. It should humble our certainty. And more than anything, it should remind us that the gift of language is not ours to use as we please, but ours to steward with fear and wonder. I've come to believe that one of the greatest dangers in life is not open rebellion, but casual speech. It is not the moments when we shake our fists at heaven, but the moments when we speak without remembering that heaven is listening. And that is why the fear of the Lord is so necessary. Not because God is angry, but because God is holy. Not because we should cower, but because we should bow. This fear is not sterile, it is not cold. It burns, but it burns clean. It strips away the arrogance that creeps into our voices. It melts the hardness that forms when we justify every word with our own logic. It purifies the motives behind our phrases. And slowly, beautifully, it teaches the mouth to honor what the heart has begun to revere. When we begin to live from that place, from the awareness that our speech carries eternal significance, we stop trying to win arguments. We stop trying to impress. We stop trying to dominate. We begin instead to bless. We begin to build. We begin to echo the voice of the one who never wasted a word.
There is a quiet beauty in the speech of someone who fears the Lord. You can hear it, not just in what they say, but in how they say it. There is patience there. There is gentleness. There is a weight that does not crush, but invites you to listen more closely, because you can feel that this voice has first been shaped in the presence of something greater. And that is the life I long to live. Not a life of anxious control over every word, but a life rooted in awe. A life where the fear of God becomes the foundation of everything I speak. Not because I'm afraid of making a mistake, but because I have seen the goodness of the one who listens, and I want every word to honor that goodness. May this fear never leave me. May it not weaken with time. May it not be dulled by success or comfort or familiarity. May it stay close, as a flame beside the altar, as a light beside my tongue, as a quiet companion reminding me that holiness begins not only in what we believe, but in how we speak.
For a long time, I thought the solution was control. I believed that if I could just train my mouth to speak more gently, if I could rehearse kindness and discipline my reactions, I would eventually become the kind of person whose words bring peace instead of pain. And so I tried. With effort, with strategy, with intention. I paused before speaking. I rehearsed soft phrases. I apologized more quickly. I monitored my tone. And for a while, it worked. On the surface, I seemed more composed, more careful, more kind. But beneath the surface, in the quiet spaces where thoughts form before they take shape, nothing had really changed. The frustration was still there. The resentment still whispered. The pride still bristled. The heart, unchanged, kept writing scripts that the mouth would eventually perform, no matter how hard I tried to silence it. That's when I began to understand something I had heard many times, but never fully received, that the mouth is not the beginning of speech. It is only the outlet, and you cannot purify a river by filtering it at the mouth. You must go to the spring. I had been polishing the faucet while ignoring the water. I had been correcting the symptoms without ever addressing the source. And the source I began to see was my heart. There is a passage that says, "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me." And I used to think of it mostly in terms of morality, a plea for forgiveness, a cry for personal holiness. But lately, I've come to hear that verse as the foundation of all true speech. Because a clean heart does not need to fabricate kind words. It produces them naturally. A renewed spirit does not need to suppress sarcasm. It has no desire to wound. And when the inner world is aligned with the Spirit of God, the outer world begins to reflect that alignment, not through performance, but through presence.
This, I believe, is why so many of our efforts to speak better ultimately exhaust us, because we're trying to produce fruit without addressing the root. We are attempting to change the outcome without transforming the origin. And though we might succeed for a season, eventually the heart will rise. It always does. I began to notice this in small moments, when someone interrupted me, and my immediate response was irritation masked as humor. When someone disagreed with me, and I responded with a sentence that sounded calm, but carried a subtle edge. When someone confided in me, and I offered advice instead of presence. These were not failures of technique. They were symptoms of a heart still learning to love. And the more I paid attention, the more I realized how much of my speech was shaped by old fears, by hidden pride, by the quiet hunger to be seen, respected, defended. My words were not just communication. They were the overflow of a soul still healing. And until that healing went deeper, my voice would remain divided, gentle in tone, but fractured in motive. So I stopped asking God to simply help me speak better. I started asking Him to change me. I asked Him to show me the places where my speech was hiding something unhealed. I asked Him to reveal the root of the sharpness, the source of the impatience, the reason behind the silence that sometimes replaced compassion. And slowly, He began to show me. Not all at once, not with condemnation, but with the kindness that speaks straight to the wound. He showed me how my defensiveness was a response to old rejection. He showed me how my sarcasm masked shame. He showed me how my silence was not wisdom, but fear. And as I began to let Him into those places, to truly open them, something in my speech began to shift. Not just the content, but the current. Not just the words, but the weight they carried.
There is a kind of peace that comes from a heart no longer divided. A kind of clarity that flows from a soul no longer trying to prove itself. And when the voice rises from that place, from that clean, centered stillness, it doesn't need to strive. It doesn't need to decorate or diminish. It simply speaks. And when it does, the room quiets. Not because the words are perfect, but because they're true. This is what I now believe. The healed heart creates a healed voice. And without that healing, our speech will always drift towards self-protection or self-promotion or self-defense. But when the heart is transformed, the voice becomes a vessel, not of us, but of the one who speaks peace into chaos and calls dead things to life. So I do not ask for eloquence anymore. I do not ask to be clever or articulate or impressive. I ask to be clean. I ask to be made whole in the hidden places, so that when I speak to a stranger, to a friend, to myself, the words that rise carry not just my voice, but His. Because in the end, it is not the tongue that needs correction. It is the heart that needs renewal. And when that renewal begins, quiet, steady, deep, the voice will follow. There is a silence in the story of Jesus that speaks louder than thunder. It does not demand attention. It does not rise to defend itself. It does not argue or accuse. It simply stands, calm, composed, completely unshaken, while the world around it trembles with noise. It is the silence of the one who had every right to speak, and yet, in the moment of greatest injustice, chose to remain still. I have often wondered what it must have been like to stand accused with lies, to be surrounded by hostility, to feel the sting of betrayal and the weight of misunderstanding, and still hold your tongue. Not because you are powerless, not because you have no answer, but because you know that sometimes the most powerful thing you can offer the world is not an argument, but a quiet confidence that refuses to be pulled into its chaos. When Jesus stood before his accusers, when he was struck, spat upon, mocked, questioned, the gospel says he did not open his mouth, not because he had nothing to say, but because his heart was rooted so deeply in the will of the Father that he had no need to prove himself. His silence was not empty. It was filled with strength. It was filled with peace. It was filled with a love that understood the difference between justice and vengeance, between being right and being whole. I have spoken many words in my life that I believe were necessary in the moment. Words to explain, to clarify, to justify, to defend. And only later did I realize that they were born not of peace, but of fear. I wanted to be understood. I wanted to be seen as right. I wanted to be safe. But Jesus, in his silence, revealed a different way. A way that trusts in something deeper than vindication. A way that values obedience over vindication, purpose over pride. And even when he did speak, he never wounded.
Not once in the Gospels do we find Jesus using his words to tear down for the sake of triumph. Not once do we hear him speak from the place of ego or retaliation. Every word, whether gentle or firm, whether whispered or declared, came from a heart completely surrendered, completely clean, completely full of grace and truth. He did not avoid hard truths. He did not dilute justice. But even in confrontation, his words never carried poison. They carried clarity. They carried love. I think of the woman caught in adultery, surrounded by condemnation, prepared for death, and how he did not begin with a lecture or a scripture or a warning. He began with stillness. He knelt. He wrote in the dust. And only after the fury of the crowd had exhausted itself did he speak, with the kind of voice that disarms, not by volume, but by compassion. Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. That sentence, perhaps more than any other, has stayed with me. Because I know how easy it is to use truth as a weapon. I know how easy it is to speak in such a way that what is right becomes sharp and what is holy becomes cold. But Jesus, he shows us that truth and love are not opposites. They are companions. And when they live together in the heart, they shape a voice that does not need to wound in order to be heard. This, for me, is the ultimate example, not just a standard to admire, but a path to walk, a way of being in the world that does not rise and fall with approval, does not react from ego, does not grasp for control through speech, but instead
speaks only what the Father gives, and sometimes says nothing at all.
There is something profoundly freeing in that kind of restraint, in knowing that we are not obligated to answer every accusation, to correct every misperception, to insert our opinion into every conversation. We are invited, instead, to listen for the Spirit, to wait until our words are not just true, but timely, until they come not from anxiety, but from alignment. And when we do speak, let it be like His. Let it carry the fragrance of mercy. Let it hold the weight of eternity with the gentleness of hope. Let it reflect a heart that has been with God, a heart that has seen the pain of the world and still chooses to bless, a heart that has learned that the loudest voice is not always the one that leads, and that sometimes the most Christ-like word is the one we never speak. That is who He is. The one who never wounded with His words. The one who could have called down angels, but instead chose silence. The one who was pierced and yet offered peace. The one whose voice still calls us to speak, not to dominate, but to redeem. And I want to sound like Him.
If you carry a wound that no one else can see, one that wasn't left by violence or distance or time, but by a sentence, a name, a silence that fell heavy in the wrong moment, then this is for you. Not as an explanation, not as a solution, but as a hand, reaching quietly through the space between us to say, I've been there too. And I know that kind of pain doesn't always fade with the passing of days. Sometimes it lingers in echoes, long after the voice that spoke it has gone silent. We speak of words as if they are fleeting things, vibrations in the air, passing from one person to another and then disappearing. But you know, and I know, that some words do not pass. They settle, they bury, they take root, and without our permission, they begin to shape the way we see ourselves, the way we walk into rooms, the way we speak to others, or avoid speaking at all. Perhaps it was something spoken to you in childhood, in anger, or carelessness, or fear, and you've carried it ever since as if it were yours to keep. Perhaps it was spoken by someone you trusted, someone whose voice mattered, and so their words had power. Perhaps it wasn't what was said, but what wasn't. The silence where love should have lived, but didn't. However it came, if it left a mark, it matters. And I want to tell you, with the gentleness I wish someone had spoken over me, that you are not what they called you. You are not the accusation, the label, the judgment, the unfinished sentence that trailed behind you like smoke. You are not the version of yourself someone saw in their moment of anger. You are not the mistake they decided to name as your identity. You are loved. You are seen. You are held. And your healing is not only possible, it is sacred. Because the same word that spoke light into darkness, the same voice that calmed the sea, the same breath that filled the lungs of the first human soul, that voice is still speaking. And when it speaks, it does not wound, it restores. It does not crush, it lifts. It does not echo your past, it calls you forward. I have come to believe that every lie we have ever internalized can be unraveled by truth. But not just truth as information, truth as presence, the kind that comes not from debate, but from encounter, from the slow, faithful voice of God,
that does not shout over our wounds, but enters them, that does not demand we forget, but invites us to remember differently through His eyes. Maybe you've been told that your words don't matter, that your voice is too small, too late, too broken to carry weight. And maybe because of what you've heard, you've decided to stay quiet, not out of wisdom, but out of fear. If that is you, hear this. Silence born from shame is not the silence of God. It is not peace, it is not healing, it is not holy. There is a difference between choosing stillness and being silenced by scars. And the way forward, I've found, is not to fight to be heard, not first. It is to let His voice become the loudest one again, the one that says, "You are more than what was said," the one that speaks your name with delight, the one that never interrupts, but always sees, always knows, always restores. There is a healing that comes not in answers, but in presence, not in explanations, but in being held. And I pray that today, even now, you would feel that presence drawing near, not to correct your pain, but to sit with it, to name it, to tell you that your story isn't over, that your voice still matters, that your future will not be written by the one who hurt you, but by the one who heals.
If you've been wounded by words, I hope you know that your soul deserves tenderness, that your healing will take time, and that time is not a weakness. I hope you know that forgiveness does not mean forgetting the damage, but trusting God with the part of your heart that still remembers it. I hope you know that every scar tells a story, and when grace meets that scar, the story can change. You are not powerless. You are not forgotten. You are not alone. And even if the voice that once hurt you still rings in your memory, I pray a different voice would begin to rise, a voice that speaks mercy, a voice that sings over you with joy, a voice that teaches you how to speak again, not as the wounded, but as the whole. You may not be there yet. That's okay. But you are not where you were. And where He is leading, there will be peace.
If I could return to that moment, the one that still lingers at the edge of your memory, the one that plays back with the clarity of a wound not quite closed, what would I say differently? If the words that once escaped my mouth like arrows could somehow be gathered, reshaped, rewritten, would your voice sound the same? I think about this more than I admit, not with bitterness, but with a quiet ache, not with guilt, but with reverence, because I've come to understand that regret is not always a curse. Sometimes it is the beginning of wisdom. It is the doorway to compassion. It is the echo that calls us back to the sacred weight of what we carry between our lips. If I could go back, I would not just change the words, I would change the posture behind them. I would speak slower, not out of caution, but out of care. I would listen longer, not because I had nothing to say, but because I finally understood that presence is more powerful than persuasion. I would let silence breathe where once I fill the air with my own assumptions. I would let kindness rise before correction. I would speak not to protect my image, but to reflect the one who gave me breath. And if I could stand before the person I once wounded, even in a small way, I would not begin with explanation. I would begin with humility. I would tell them that I finally understand what I didn't then, that words are never weightless, that every sentence leaves a mark, and some marks do not fade, that being right never mattered as much as being kind, that being heard is not the same as being holy, but I can't go back.
And maybe that's the mercy in all of this, that life moves forward, not to deny our failures, but to transform them. That even the things we cannot undo can be redeemed, not by erasure, but by the way we live from this point forward. That grace does not ask us to forget.
It asks us to become people who speak as if the world is listening, as if every word matters, as if every breath could build or break, plant or poison, heal or harm. So I ask myself now, not with pressure, but with intention, what kind of voice do I want to carry into the next room I enter, into the next conversation I hold, into the silence of someone else's pain, into the noise of someone else's conflict? And the answer is always the same. I want to carry a voice shaped by mercy. A voice that has walked through fire and learned not to burn. A voice that remembers its own failures and chooses, because of them, to speak more gently. I want to carry a voice that pauses often, listens deeply, and only speaks when it has something worth offering. Not to impress, not to control, but to bless. Because now I know the tongue is not just a tool, it is a trust. And the heart is not just a source, it is a sanctuary. And every time I open my mouth, I open the door to something holy or something hollow, and I do not want to waste that door. If I could go back, I would speak with reverence. But since I cannot, I will go forward that way. I will go forward with a slower tongue, with a softer tone, with a cleaner heart, not because I have mastered myself, but because I have been met by mercy, and from that mercy I will speak.
If somewhere along the way, this story echoed something you've carried, a memory, a moment, a prayer you didn't know how to speak, then let this be more than a message. Let it be an invitation, not to agree, not to perform, but to pause, to breathe, to ask quietly and honestly, what kind of voice do I want to carry from this point forward? Because we do carry our voices, whether we notice it or not, into homes, into friendships, into silence, into tension, into mornings when the soul feels fragile, and into nights when our words echo longer than we expect. And in every one of those places, our speech leaves something behind. If this reflection stirred something in you, a longing to speak differently, to begin again, to walk more gently through the space of another's heart, then you are not alone. You are not too late. You are not disqualified by what you once said. You are being drawn into a deeper way, a way where speech becomes sacred, where silence becomes wise, where even regret becomes a teacher, not a jailer. And if that desire feels small, if it trembles, if it doesn't know where to begin, begin here. Begin with a simple prayer. God, make my heart clean so my voice can follow. Begin with one pause before you speak. Begin with one sentence less. Begin with one word more carefully chosen. Begin with the next breath. Because the change doesn't have to be loud to be holy. It just has to be real.
If you know someone who has been wounded by words, or someone whose voice has turned heavy with silence, share this with them. Not to fix, not to correct, but to say, I see you. I hear you. I've been there too. Sometimes healing begins not with answers, but with accompaniment. And sometimes the most life-giving thing we can offer another soul is not instruction, but presence. And if this found you at a time when you needed it, if it whispered into your day with a kind of warmth you didn't expect, then help it find someone else. Leave a comment, share a word, pass it along, not because of numbers, not because of visibility, but because someone else may be sitting with the same ache, waiting for a voice that knows how to speak gently. We never know where our words will land, but we do know this: when they come from a heart made clean, they never land empty. So may your voice be rooted in peace. May your tongue speak life, even when it trembles. May your silence be full of presence, not fear. And may your words, whether few or many, reflect the mercy that first spoke your name. You are loved. You are not alone. And you are being made new. Go gently. Speak slowly. Walk in grace.